Strickland. This webcast is one of a series in which I'm presenting some brief lectures and commentaries on topics from the courses I teach in literature and cultural studies. Here I'll be giving a brief overview of the development of the concept of poetics as a background introduction for my course in literary theory. It begins, as does most of the Western tradition of philosophy, with Plato. In his Republic, Plato proposed the conditions for an ideal utopian society. For Plato, physical reality, social reality were mere shadows of an ideal, eternal realm of forms or patterns of things and concepts that were only realized imperfectly in our material experience. So Plato would argue, for example, that a physical table or a chair are only imperfect or temporary realizations of the ideal form of tableness or chairness. What we should aspire to is the ideal that transcends our everyday experience. So in the Republic, Plato considered poetry, by which he meant drama, fiction, all kinds of literary representations. Plato says something like, well, we know that fiction presents imitations of things and concepts, not the real things or concepts in themselves. In effect, all poetic works, all fictional works are lies. Do we want lies? Do we want falsehoods in the ideal republic? Plato says no. We only want the truth, the search for the truth, philosophy in the ideal republic. Therefore, poetry, fiction should be banned from the ideal republic. So Plato's thought about poetry, poetics, was idealist and evaluative. Poetry was not as valuable as truth. Therefore, poetry should be rejected. Plato's contemporary and his student, Aristotle, had a different approach. In contrast to Plato's idealist, prescriptive, and evaluative or judgmental approach to poetics, Aristotle's approach was realistic, pragmatic, and descriptive. Aristotle would say something like, well, we have these great plays by Sophocles, by Euripides, by Aeschylus. It's obvious that people enjoy these plays and value them highly. So let's set aside the question of whether they are good in an ideal sense and look instead at the conditions that these works share in common, the conditions that go to making up a great work of literature. In his Poetics, Aristotle describes poetry as the art of mimesis or imitation. But unlike Plato, who sees imitation as a third-rate production, because it imitates material, physical things, or concepts from our consciousness that are themselves imperfect, Aristotle accepts imitation as a good thing. So Aristotle sets about to describe what makes a great work of literature, what makes a great drama, what makes a great tragedy. He finds that great tragedies have three kinds of unities in common. They have a unity of action. A great tragedy has one plot, a clear plot, that doesn't digress to lose the audience's attention. And he finds that great tragedies have a unity of time. By the most strict definition, that is, the action of the play should elapse in a period of not more than 24 hours. And third, that great tragedies have a unity of place. The action unfolds in one location. The characters are not found in Athens in one moment and in Sparta in the next. Aristotle then elaborates, discussing qualities of the plot, of character, of diction, and of spectacle. About the tragic hero, he says, the tragic hero is basically good, but not perfect. The tragic hero has some significant flaw that will eventually lead to his downfall. The tragic hero must behave in a way that is appropriate and consistent. A character doesn't suddenly change radically without any explanation for why the change has happened. Next, I'll skip forward by 3 centuries to the Roman poet Horace. Horace lived in the 1st century BC, and in addition to his poems, he wrote a text called the Ars Poetica, or the art of poetry. Horace tries to describe the conditions or the criteria for making a poem truly great. A good poem should have thematic unity, harmony, and proportion. It should have a wise choice of subject and good diction. The meter and the style should be appropriate to the theme of the poem. But Horace's most notable statement is that the great work of literature must please and instruct. It must be entertaining, but it also must impart an important lesson. So I see some elements of both Plato's concerns and Aristotle's approach in Horace's Ars Poetica. Leaving the classical era behind and moving to the English Renaissance, the 16th century, my next example is Sir Philip Sidney's Defense of Poesy, a title sometimes modernized as An Apology for Poetry. Sir Philip Sidney accepts Plato's definition of art, including literature, as merely an imitation or a reflection of reality. But Sidney rejects Plato's argument that literature is harmful. In its imitations of human experience, poetry can show human beings not as they are, but as they should be. As the Wikipedia entry on the Defense of Poesy puts it, by combining the liveliness of history with the ethical focus of philosophy, for Sidney, poetry is more effective than either history or philosophy in rousing its readers to virtue. The 18th century in English literature and culture is called the Neoclassical age. It was a time when writers specifically looked back to Aristotle for models. One such writer and critic was Dr. Samuel Johnson. In his preface to Shakespeare, Dr. Johnson wrote that Shakespeare's greatness consisted in his ability to present just representations of general nature, that is, accurate representations of human nature in general. In his critical assessment of Shakespeare, Dr. Johnson adhered to some of the criteria advanced by the classical figures I mentioned before. He emphasized decorum and order, propriety, like Horace and Aristotle. For example, he criticized Shakespeare's language, and there's even an echo of Plato's concern with morality in Dr. Johnson's criticism. He dislikes Shakespeare's King Lear, for example, because an innocent, good character like Cordelia dies, as well as the flawed or evil characters in the play. 18th century English poetry is tightly organized, balanced, and well-ordered, with exalted themes, elegant diction, and no rough edges. That tradition was rudely disrupted in 1798 with the publication by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge of a volume called Lyrical Ballads. With their preface to Lyrical Ballads, Wordsworth and Coleridge heralded a revolution in thought about poetics that reverberates into our own time. They proposed to write a new kind of poetry. First, their subjects would include the experiences of ordinary people. They argued that the real language spoken by ordinary people was a suitable language for the language of poetry, and they privileged emotion over reason. They argued that the expression of feeling is just as important as action, thought, or fact. The preface famously declared that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions, recollected in tranquility. So the poet has a great inspirational moment and then goes home, thinks about it, and writes it down. I will conclude this segment of my brief overview of literary theory with Matthew Arnold, a critic who writes in stark reaction against the revolutionary poetics of Wordsworth and Coleridge. Arnold is reacting in a counter-revolutionary way, both aesthetically and politically. Matthew Arnold was a distinguished poet, a government inspector of schools. He became a professor of poetry at Oxford, and he wrote influential essays and books, including one entitled Culture and Anarchy. In the course of his visits to schools all over England, Arnold came to the conclusion that British society was in imminent danger of decline. In England, traditionally, the Catholic Church and then the Anglican Church since the 16th century had functioned as a structure to bond the society together and to promote order. But in the rapidly industrializing society of England in the 19th century, fewer and fewer people were attending church. There was some danger that the decline of religious observance might eventually lead to the breakup of the social order. Arnold proposed that English literature could come to the rescue. English literature could be taught in the public schools, and through the study of English literature, generations of students would absorb the values that the church had promoted and that had held English society together over the centuries. For Arnold, the study of poetry could become a way of maintaining a conservative, traditional social order. In a subsequent installment, I'll provide a brief overview of the trajectory of English and American literary criticism and theory in the 20th century. As always, if you have questions or comments, send me an email.